Now please listen very carefully to what I'm going to say. As startling and as perhaps racist as this comment seems on its face, if you begin from the idea, as he did, that there is an unequal evolution because it's random, it's unpredictable, circumstances here or circumstances are over there, he came to the only logical conclusion to which evolution can bring us. That men are inherently unequal. Am I making myself clear? It's critical that we understand. The only way we can say all men are created equal is if there is a creator that made them in his image. When we surrender that truth, we have no basis for this document right here. Now, I've heard, and I won't say who, he's not the one on in the afternoon, but once in a while driving around, I turn on conservative radio and I listen to him. And there's one guy on there who, sometimes I love him, sometimes I hate him, sometimes I just turn him off and pray, which is probably what I should do all the time. But he said the other day, anybody who believes in creation is absolutely stupid. And I thought, then you better get off conservative radio, friend, because you've got no leg to stand on.
That's right. Yeah.
Because as Dr. Watson pointed out, elementary, my dear Watson, as he pointed out, unless men are created by God, there is no guarantee that we are equal. That we cannot surrender that truth. Now we're going to move on to another critical element. And that is, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That also is important for us to understand. We do not get rights from the government. We may get privileges, but we don't get rights. The rights come from the Creator to the individual. And in a moment, you're going to see why that is absolutely, absolutely fundamental. They're endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And this brings us to my notes over to the side. This opening helps us to explain one of the most fundamental beliefs of the founders, that the only reliable basis for sound government is what our founders referred to as natural law, or the laws of nature and of nature's God. Now, when we hear that today, what we tend to think of is some kind of crazy wicked kind of thing, some kind of wind blowing, and whoo-hoo, and that kind of thing. That's what we think of. But in their thinking, it was much, much different than that. In John 17, Jesus said, I think one of the most, of all of the things that he said, how can I say some things Jesus said were more important than others? Forgive me for my lack of being able to communicate this. But there's a brief phrase that has always struck me. John 17:17b, when Jesus was praying the high priestly prayer, and he said, "Thy word is truth." That word truth in the Greek means the fundamental reality that lies at the end of every argument. God's word is what our founders would have seen as natural law. It was explained by a variety of different authors, starting back with the Roman philosopher Cicero, clear back in about 106 to 43 BC. What was interesting at the time that these documents were created is that there was a much more uniform idea of what an educated person needed to have read and been and experienced. Today, you could come out with a degree in any topic, and what you learned at Ohio State could be entirely different than what you learn at Wright State, which is entirely different than what you learn at Hillsdale College and the University of Miami. This was not true at that time. Most of these men had been fundamentally influenced by much of the same writing, the same philosophers, the same study. The men, John Locke, Sir William Blackstone, Baron Charles Montesquieu's writings were full of an explanation of what natural law is. And generally speaking, it's simply this. There is the recognition that there is a supreme creator. But not only does he exist, but that he has established laws that are true for every area of life. And those writers at the time concluded that if there is a creator, and he has created laws that are immutable, the only intelligent thing for a person to do is to get to know him, to find out what those laws are, and to obey them. That was good sense as far as they were concerned. That was the explanation of natural law. When we look back at the book of Romans, the first chapter, I've just come to love that chapter so much because there are so many answers to what we're facing today explained for us in Romans, the first chapter. And one of the things that Romans, the first chapter, makes very clear is that God has made his laws understandable, that anyone can see and understand them. I'm going to go out a little bit on a limb here and all, but you don't even have to be Christian to understand God's laws. People who do not understand or know God have stumbled on to his truths. Now, it's a lot easier to know God's laws when you know him because his Spirit lives within you and he's constantly revealing that to you. But truth is truth no matter who discovers it. And so in natural law, in Romans, the first chapter says he's made these things evident. The honest seeker can see and find these things. And how they defined natural law was this idea that the Creator has established an order for all things. And that this natural law is eternal, that it's universal, that it cannot be repealed, that it cannot be altered, and it cannot be abandoned. Now, a simple example is this. The United States Congress can get together and decide they're going to negate the law of gravity. And it passes the House, and it passes the Senate, and the President signs off on it, and the Supreme Court says it's constitutional for them to do that. But my friend, I am not going to go up onto the top of the Capitol and step off. I don't care what the Congress of the United States says about that. It is an immutable law. Now, that is a very obvious example. It's a physical law. But when our founders wrote about natural laws, what they said is that God's moral standards are just as immutable. It does not matter if the Congress of the United States doesn't think so. It doesn't change the fact that God has established the order of things, and it may not be altered. It cannot be legislated away. And one of the things that I think we need to understand, just a little historical note, is oftentimes you hear, oh, George Washington, he was a deist, and Thomas Jefferson was a deist, and this and that and the other. But deism was very different. People use the term deism today almost interchangeably with the idea of atheism. And nothing could be farther from the truth. Because in deism, essentially what they said was this: there is a God, he is ruling, but rather than ruling by fiat, by getting involved, he's established this order of these laws, and he's sitting back, and the way he is administrating the universe is through his immutable laws. That is very different than there is no God and I'll do whatever I want to do. So be very careful when you start hearing that argument today about, oh, this one was a deism or that. I'd take some deists in Washington, D.C. right now if we could get it. Say it. I would like to have some people who believe that there are rules that have to be followed no matter who you are. All right. Sorry? I'm trying to keep my opinions out of this. I really am trying to keep my opinions out of this because we as a church and as believers have got to understand what we're studying is so much bigger than Democrat or Republicans. Because, you know, I'm very hopeful about the midterm elections coming up. But I'll tell you, there's some Republicans, we can vote them in and we're going to be in the same boat we're in right now. My mother used to say you put them in a bag and shake them up, you don't know who's going to come out first. I mean, they're all, so I want to stay away from that. But this is so much bigger than just politics. We've got to understand these principles. The second critical element that we have to understand at this point is what they said. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Not government is given rights, but the individual created by God is endowed with these rights. Now, why is this absolutely critical? Because what they're going to go on to tell us is this: that government has no inherent rights of its own. What government has is the authority that we give to it. We call it government by the consent of the governed. The rights that we have are given to us by God as individuals. Rights are given to people who in turn share their authority with government as they see fit. Now let me give you an example, a simple example. I own a house. I don't want anybody to break into my house. So I have the right to stand in the door, or stand in my yard or whatever, and if somebody comes into my yard, I can take whatever measures are necessary within reason, within God's Word, we should say within reason, within God's Word, to protect my home. But I get tired of sitting in my yard afraid somebody's going to come in. I want to go down to the King's Island and have fun with my grandkids. So what I say is this: why don't I find somebody to share my authority with? He'll drive up and down the street. I'll give him a uniform so everybody knows who he is. I'll let him wear a badge that will identify the fact that he's sharing my authority. I'll even get him a black and white car with a red bubble on the top so when he comes up and down, people will know that he has the authority vested in him, not his own authority, but I've shared my authority with him so he can watch my house while I go to King's Island with the grandkids. That's how our founders saw government. That those things that were better served by others, we would share our authority with them.